Really appreciate the opportunity to talk to everybody here today. By way of introduction, my name is Austin Larson. I'm a principal threat analyst with Google Threat Intelligence Group. I help Google respond to significant cyber threats. Prior to my time with Google Threat Intelligence Group, I spent a number of years doing incident response work, which is when me and Tony were first introduced.
Yep, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tony Quinones. I'm a special agent out of FBI San Francisco office, where I work on a national security cyber squad. And I guess it was a bit over 2 years ago now where Austin and I first started working together, responding to, the first Barracuda email security gateway incident. And ever since then, we've been consistently working together on a variety of PRC cyber incidents. And so when he asked me if we wanted to present at this event, I was like, I think, yeah, of course. I think we've done some really good work. But more importantly, I think we have a really good example of what collaboration, really good, effective collaboration between law enforcement and the private sector looks like. And I think we should really share that.
Awesome. So to get started, starting first looking at the broader landscape. For zero-day exploitation, we're seeing zero-day exploitation trend up. And we're seeing zero-day exploits target not only VPNs and security devices, but also mobile and other personal devices. And zero days are not going away. And that feeds into the broader narrative of the PRC cyber espionage landscape. So a few things that we're seeing is one is the continued focus on the edge. We're seeing that PRC actors are less reliant on social engineering, not that we don't see that, but we see them using 0 days, also N days, and they by far lead their peers, nation-state peers, in terms of zero-day exploitation. We also see them using orb networks or ephemeral networks that mask IP addresses that make it much harder to track and detect these actors. This is in line with other stealth tactics that we've seen PRC actors adopt, which we'll talk about. One of these is living off the land, and so we are continuing to see PRC actors live off the land, and it makes it harder to detect them with traditional security tools. And most concerningly, I would say, is the trend of PRC actors targeting supply chains, and specifically supply chain companies, for example, SaaS companies, and leveraging that access to access downstream victims and customers.
Yeah. And I think one thing I would add on to that, when we talk about orb networks here, a proportion of those include compromised SOHO routers. And so when we start thinking about it, this brings sort of the impact of PRC cyber efforts right to the homes of everyday people. And that's, I think, a concerning evolution in their tactics.
Absolutely. So getting started with the case study of the exploitation of Barracuda email security gateway appliances that occurred in 2023. This was a widespread espionage campaign with hundreds of victims, which had really big implications on national security. And I think it's a great example of how we were able to work with the FBI and other partners to combat this threat. So what was CVE 2023-2868? This was a command injection vulnerability in Barracuda ESG appliances. And these were email appliances that lived on the edge of customer networks. Essentially, they were sitting on the edge of customer networks, filtering inbound mail, scanning them for malicious attachments before sending them on. This vulnerability is exploited by a threat actor that we track as UNC4841 as early as October of 2022. Cutting to the chase, we believe that UNC4841 conducts espionage operations on behalf of the People's Republic of China. One thing to note too is this affected all ESG versions in the appliance form factor at the time that this vulnerability was announced. So how is this exploited? The UNC4841 exploited this vulnerability by sending specially crafted by sending emails with specially crafted tar file attachments. And these attachments, as intended, would be scanned by the appliance. And the method of scanning was an open source library known as Amavis. This is a Perl library, and you'll see a trend here with Amavis as we go on here. When Amavis would scan this special tar file, it would unpack it, and due to this vulnerability, it would then execute a command, in this case using OpenSSL, which is highlighted in blue there, to open up a reverse shell to attack our infrastructure. So here's some examples of what these emails look like. And keep in mind, there were hundreds and hundreds of these emails sent to various victims around the world. And you'll notice something is that these look like generic spam messages, right? And we think that was very intentional on behalf of the actors. If you were a SOC analyst reviewing this, you'd say, oh, it's spam, and move on.
Yeah, because I think the key thing here is that these emails didn't have to be interacted by any human, and a lot of them may have just been scanned and blocked or scanned and pushed into a spam box. It didn't matter to the exploit here.
Yeah, absolutely. So after they ran this exploit, right, they had a reverse shell. What did they do next? They deployed a series of malware families, the most popular of which that was used by the actor we track as CSpy. This malware family established itself as a PCAP filter on SMTP port 25 and 587, essentially listening for inbound packets. And the malware was designed in such a way to listen for magic packets by the threat actor, which were specially crafted packets, really small packets that contained the IP to open up another reverse shell to, right? So it's a way of establishing persistent access in a really stealthy way, because this is something else we were seeing from PRC actors, is the use of passive backdoors. So they're not actively beaconing out on a regular interval. That's a lot of intrusion prevention and detection solutions can detect that. They're just waiting for a packet inbound. And the last thing to note here is, these, again, are living on the edge. So they're receiving random scans and packets all day long. And so this would have been very difficult for any organization to detect. And they did. And as far as we're aware, nobody actually detected this during this campaign. So what were they after, right? Well, these ESG devices stored mail temporarily, although the duration of how temporary depended on how these customers configured their devices, in a folder known as the M store. And what we found is that after compromising the device and deploying CSpy, the actor would deploy scripts to search through the M store. And you'll see here a sanitized version of one of these scripts where we identified the actor searching for the emails of very specific users or email domains of organizations that were of interest to them. We also believe that the actor was searching through this email store for credentials for use in other operations. From there, you'll see an example of them compressing the output and exfiltrating it to their infrastructure.
Yeah, and I think it bears in mind that this likely was a blind spot for many organizations when they're looking at setting up their appliances, right? Your email traffic, sort of your data, you typically want sitting inside your perimeter, right? But you have a network edge device sitting out here that, as it's scanning, it's caching all the emails that are going in and going out, and that the PRC threat actors were able to identify that this was the case and targeted it, really went after it.
Yeah. So who are they after? Early on in the campaign, when we were first engaged, by Barracuda, it was initially somewhat small in scope, but we very rapidly learned that we were dealing with a very big problem, which is when we were engaged with FBI San Francisco, and in coordination with FBI, Barracuda, and our own investigations, what we found is a widespread campaign impacting hundreds of organizations across a very long period of time, which we'll talk about that in a minute. But who are they after? The majority of the victims were based in North America. Now, that being said, that's probably representative of Barracuda's customer base. But something that's really interesting that we found during our analysis is that you'll notice some targeting in mainland, or rather in China. What we observed is that this was actually likely testing. The earliest known evidence of compromise occurred against victims in China. We think this was likely domestic testing for a few reasons. One, the malware samples did not contain all the same security features that were later deployed against the rest of the world, and they also used a different port. But really interesting to see domestic testing before really turning this campaign global.
Yeah, and it really gave us a look into how the threat actor kind of goes after, systematically prepares, their campaign ahead of time here. And I think Austin has a good chart on that further on. Yeah, so, Mandiant was engaged, I think, by Barracuda, but from the FBI's perspective, as the news of this incident was kind of breaking, we were notified by an initial victim and kind of quickly figured out that this was a pretty serious incident. And so we deployed FBI's incident response team to that victim and really started scoping out what was happening, collecting evidence. And at that point is when we were able to get involved really early on with Mandiant and the vendor here. And by sharing all that we were getting, what they were seeing, and what we had, the FBI was pretty quickly able to make an attribution that, hey, yeah, these threat actors, these are PRC-sponsored cyber actors, which allowed us to start orienting our investigation. And I think importantly here also, this early collaboration, sort of getting involved as the incident was breaking, we're able to figure out that there are a lot of victims here. And not every victim Mandiant was able to contact, the vendor was able to contact. And this is where the FBI was really able to bring all our resources to bear. I mean, we have offices across the country, we got agents across the country, right? And so I was quickly able to coordinate dozens of agents going out and physically standing on a doorstep, knocking on a door and telling people that, hey, your appliance has been compromised by the PRC, and able to get them on that path to disrupting that compromise and start remediating the system, sort of giving them the steps that we're able to develop with Mandiant and the vendor here to stop this compromise. And I think, as Austin will elaborate here further, this wasn't a linear process. As we started responding to this incident, the attacker was adapting and responding to our efforts as well. And so, we were able to stay engaged and in the process. And as we continue to identify new victims with new malware, we're able to get back out there and continue to notify victims to disrupt them as early as possible.
So taking a look at the timeline of this campaign, the earliest evidence, like I mentioned before, of exploitation of this zero-day vulnerability occurred October 10th of 2022. And for the first couple of weeks, this was exclusively in China. Then the exploitation turned more broad, and for a period of 8 months, UNC4841 remained undetected across hundreds of impacted appliances, collecting email for espionage purposes. On May 16th, Barracuda identified the first evidence of compromise on an appliance, and Mandiant Consulting, including myself, were called in to investigate. And what we found over the course of 2 days was it was a very long 2 days, but what we found is that it wasn't just 2 impacted devices, it was many impacted devices. And we were able to, working with Barracuda, identify a vulnerability in Amavis and also develop and release a patch to this vulnerability, which was issued on May 20th, just a few days later. Now, on May 21st, Barracuda began eradication activities, and this involved remotely deploying a script to impacted devices to remove the known backdoors and attempt to evict the actor. Within a matter of hours of this script being deployed, UNC4841 responded. What we found is that within hours of the remediation activities beginning, UNC4841 began to deploy new variants of CSpy, as well as another malware family known as Saltwater, that circumvented this patching. A few days later, they started high-frequency operations to maintain access to these devices. Additionally, we identified them modify 7 different components of CSpy and then 2 different components of Saltwater to avoid the detections that we were deploying to these devices. And you'll see the public advisory here, which we believe also helped, which we know the threat actor is also watching these public advisories, which is something to consider when you're thinking about your incident response plan, is that when you're dealing with a sophisticated adversary, they are watching. They're watching what you're doing on systems oftentimes, but also publicly and your messaging. So looking at C-SPY v2, so what was different about it? So first, they packed it with UPX. They stripped debugging symbols, again, making it harder to detect these with, for example, like Yara rules. But we also saw them, I thought this was pretty interesting, is that they added authentication into the backdoor. So not just anybody could connect to it. You had to have a hard-coded RSA key in order to access this backdoor. So same capabilities, but definitely they were trying to preempt and prevent some of the detection that we were doing. What I would say is probably the most interesting piece of malware as part of this campaign, in my opinion, was about a week after Barracuda issued a pretty strong guidance to RMA any impacted device. I mean, once we saw that the threat actor was responding to us, the guidance essentially was given that any impacted device had to be sent back to the vendor to receive a patched version, or at least that was a recommendation to do so. And what we found is that the actor even responded to this guidance that was issued publicly by very quickly developing, which is in a very short time frame, a malware family known as depth charge. I think CISA tracks this one as submarine.
Yes, yeah, I believe that's still.
Yeah. And what this one is that it's it listens similar. It's another passive backdoor. It listens on the SMTP ports, and it essentially it also it preloaded itself into the Barracuda SMTP daemon. So it was almost, it was Trojanizing, a legitimate process. Now, the notable part about this malware is how it persisted, right? So it would deploy itself onto infected devices, or rather the actor would deploy it on infected devices, and it would embed itself into the SQLite backup file on the device. So think about, if you were instructed to replace an edge device and replace it with a new one, you're likely going to export your configuration so you can import it to the new one. So you don't have to spend all that time copying over every setting, right? Well, the actor knew this, and they knew that a lot of organizations would do this, and so depth charge embedded itself into that backup file when it was generated, and then when they would re-import into a clean device, depth charge would go along with it in that SQL database configuration file. Now, this was very narrowly deployed. This was, I would say, probably only 1% to 2% of victims had this deployed, and it was very good insight into, who are the priority targets for the PRC and this actor, and it was primarily against government entities, military targets, as well as certain tech targets, SaaS providers that would provide downstream access to other priority targets.
Yeah, and I think, going through all these adaptations that the threat actor did, I think we all can sort of think about the resources the PRC has to implement their cyber campaigns, but I think looking at this example here where you have multiple rounds of adaptation, multiple kind of types of malware, and multiple avenues of persistence really kind of highlight the level of the threat that we can face here. It's like they're quite persistent.
Yeah, absolutely. So a few things. So first off, the PRC, UNC4841 responded to us, but so did the PRC. And shortly after the publication, and as part of our response to this campaign, we were coordinating with the FBI with victims, but we also published two pretty in-depth threat intelligence reports publicly on the Google Threat Intelligence blog, which the PRC foreign minister saw and was questioned about during a press briefing, and he claimed that our report was far-fetched and unprofessional, which I will note is almost identical to the response that was given to Mandiant's release of the APT1 report.
Yeah, and so, Mandiant and the vendor were doing a great job of getting the messaging out, but, as we went through this process, the FBI was continuing to see that, they were still compromised devices out there, and so we decided to take the step of, using our public platform to put out public notifications to reinforce the message that, hey, this is serious, you need to RMA your device, because we were, the compromise was fairly widespread, and it wasn't just your traditional, high-value targets, people who are, really plugged in on making sure that their devices are, patched and fixed. are made, but you're talking about, small everyday businesses, like there were small clinics, churches, like counseling centers. Those are the ones we really wanted to get out and reach from the FBI perspective because, they continue to be victims. And whether or not their emails may have been of interest, their devices were compromised and were being used for follow-on attacks as well.
So as part of this campaign, we had really what I would say are rare insights into this actor. And this is due to our close collaboration with Barracuda Networks, who really leaned into countering this campaign. And due to some collaboration, some strategies we just had a lot of visibility into specific actions the actor was taking across the whole fleet of Barracuda devices. And by doing analysis on just the whole campaign as a whole, looking at hundreds of thousands of signals, we were able to paint a pretty interesting picture. So if you look here on this graph, you'll see the red is the number of victims, and then the blue bar chart on the bottom is actually threat actor activity. So commands are running, actions are taking across these compromised devices. And you'll see early in October 2020, in October 2022, that this is the early testing. And then once they turn that campaign global, you'll see that victim count spike. And that's the initial wave of exploitation and deployment of malware. And then there's that 8-month period of espionage. Now, during that 8-month period, there's one part that is pretty interesting, is that there's only one 3-day delay, or one 3-day break that the actor ever took. And that just so happens to coincide with the beginning of Chinese New Year. Which again, it's a rare insight. You normally don't get to have this level of visibility into a specific actor, but I'll let you speculate as to why that's the case. Now, you could also see, so you could see once towards the end, the actor began to increase the frequency of their operations, and after public notification, there was a big spike in activity. And this is the actor deploying new malware and also attempting to collect as much email as possible, as well as deploying depth charge and other related malware to maintain their access. Now, after this campaign, Mandiant Intelligence, now Google Threat Intelligence Group, we continue to monitor UNC4841, and we found a few interesting things. Where a few weeks later, we found a new variant of C-Spy was uploaded to VirusTotal in September of 2023. This sample was consistent with the updated V2 versions of C-Spy, but its name was Juno Script Service. So it was masquerading as a legitimate service on Juniper routers. Around that same time frame, or a few months later, we also identified UNC4841 associated domains masquerading as Juniper developer products. Now, we were able to identify this fairly early on and alert Juniper and work with our partners in the federal government, and we've not seen widespread exploitation of Juniper devices, but you could definitely see that they were planning and scheming on what their next campaign might be. We also recovered a macOS variant of C-Spy that was hosted on UNC4841 infrastructure. This was uploaded to their server in mid-2023. And what's really interesting about this one is we've talked about a lot about like edge malware, right? Which is definitely the trend, and PRC actors definitely love to live on the edge. That being said, it's not always their end goal, and this makes that very clear in that this Mac variant of C-Spy would listen on the basically the Wi-Fi interface of the device, listening for a magic packet to open up that reverse shell 2, indicating that the actor was likely living on the edge, but wanted to reach in deeper into the network. And around the same time, we actually found that UNC4841, based on some files identified on their infrastructure, that they were likely exploiting actually a Mac vulnerability in Apache MQ that dates back to 2023. So pretty interesting. We were never able to actually find these Mac compromises, but it's good to know that this is likely something either that they were developing or something that they were doing on certain networks.
Yeah, and I mean, then this case of intel sharing that Austin would pass to us here, I think was very important because we were still kind of digging out of the Barracuda incident, going through everything we got, but we were already very keyed on that this group was something we need to watch. They were capable. And so getting this information allowed us to orient ourselves, okay, this is the threat, and prepare ourselves and be on the lookout because, should this break, we want to really try to be as proactive as we can and get in front of it before it's widespread.
So this is actually not the end of the UNC4841 campaign targeting Barracuda. What we found is that we identified successful exploitation of a new vulnerability in Barracuda ESG devices on November 30th of 2023. This was CV 2023-7101. To exploit this, UNC41 again sent specially crafted email attachments that instead of tar files, these were Excel documents. And a very similar Perl library that was used for scanning these Excel documents had a zero-day vulnerability, which is exploited. After this vulnerability is exploited, you'll see almost an identical OpenSSL command that they used to open up a reverse shell. Here's an example of what some of these emails look like. And you'll notice they changed, right? We called them out for their emails being low quality in our initial blog post. I don't know if they're offended, but you can see now they're writing more convincing emails that these attachments were attached to.
Yeah, but I think they got a little lazy and didn't finish filling out their spreadsheet in many of them.
That is true. That is true. So one thing to note about this before I move on is this was caught very early on. I mean, we're talking about a matter of hours, if not days, and we immediately started coordinating with Tony, FBI San Francisco, and Barracuda to eradicate and patch this in record time. I think there was lessons learned from the previous incident and also better detections rolled out across the ESG fleet. And so we were able to really rapidly identify and respond to this series of intrusions. And the number of victims for this one was really only a handful. So I think that was definitely an example of a win in countering PRC threats.
Absolutely. Yeah. We view this as sort of a great success. The output of our continued relationship, our collaboration, the fact that we knew who to talk to, we had the playbook, we were familiar with each other, and we know what to look for. Once we saw this out, like I said, the disruption happened, very early on, and the impact ended up being fairly limited, which was, a great outcome.
Yep. So another VirusTotal sample. In late January of 2024, we identified yet another CSPI sample on VirusTotal. However, this one had a name that we didn't recognize at first. It was MGMailerD. But doing some Googling, what we found is that this process name was the process name associated with another email product. This one was known as Mailgates. And you'll see here in the sample the process name there. What we found is that UNC4841 was targeting another email product known as OpenFind Mailgates Mail Protection System. And these are typically very similar to Barracuda, deployed in front of corporate mail servers for malware and spam filtering. Now, one thing notable about this product is that it's almost exclusively only used in Taiwan and Japan. But they were using the same old tricks. They were sending emails with RAR attachments that exploited a vulnerability in another Perl library filtering process. And there was also a CVE issued in 2022 for this path traversal vulnerability in UNRAR that was there. We also saw earlier Amavis exploitation that was actually reported by the Taiwan CERT just a little bit before that about an Amavis vulnerability being exploited in Mailgates. So kind of interesting, and also that Taiwan CERT notification about this Amavis vulnerability is the only one that they've ever reported on in Mailgates, which I think is kind of interesting. So a tried and true formula for UNC4841. The initial compromise, exploitation of edge devices, email security gateways, especially those that use Amavis. They know this Perl library inside and out. And it's something to consider Well, I guess one thing to consider as well is sometimes it's not just the code, it's the implementation of these open source libraries, right? It's not just that the code is vulnerable, which sometimes it is, but it's also the way it's implemented has led to a lot of the exploitation of Amavis. Establishing foothold using these open SSL reverse shells, using custom malware, passive backdoors, using cron jobs and scripts, obtaining credentials, and then moving to internal reconnaissance. We did see in some cases port scanning and vulnerability scanning, but this happened very late in the game once that they knew that they were burned. And then harvesting of stored data from targets of interest was really their end goal.
Yeah, they really identified sort of the ideal device for them to target, and they developed a very good way of, very good vulnerability sort of pathway to get in. And, you know, as we saw, 3 times in like a year, they used it.
So looking at UNC4841, attribution, so looking at their targeting, because of the unique insights that we had into their operation, we were able to assess with high confidence that UNC4841 is a China Nexus actor, operating on behalf of the People's Republic of China for espionage purposes. And we know this for a variety of reasons, but to give you some insight, we saw them, for example, targeting the emails of academics in Taiwan and Hong Kong. We also saw them targeting Asian and European government officials in Southeast Asia. We also saw them targeting trade officials in Europe. The targeting of mailgates as well, that were predominantly used in Taiwan, was also telling. And in terms of the malware they're using, there's several code overlaps that we identified with China Nexus malware, but also the use of public projects and design methodologies like CDOR and other public malware frameworks that are usually harder to attribute are popular among China Nexus groups, and we definitely saw them using that. The infrastructure they're using. We saw some of the domain registration overlaps with other China Nexus espionage groups, their infrastructure. And then we actually saw in some rare cases the magic packets were originating from China or from NetBlocks in China. Anything else on this one?
Yeah, totally agree with everything you're saying. Yeah, couldn't agree more.
Nice.
PRC cyber actors.
Awesome. Look, this isn't the only example, right, of PRC espionage. This was talked about earlier by Daniel and others in a talk earlier today, but the exploitation of Ivanti Connect Secure VPN is something that we've been investigating for a number of years in collaboration with Ivanti. Just from a high level, to give you a couple examples of some of the exploitation that we've seen against Ivanti, we've seen a number of vulnerabilities, but to highlight on just a couple today on a specific campaign, CV 2023-46805, the authentication bypass vulnerability, as well as a command injection vulnerability. These are similar to Barracuda devices. They live on the edge of the networks, except these are VPN solutions rather than email solutions. And we identified that they were exploited as these vulnerabilities were exploited as a 0-day dating back to December 3rd of 2023. And similarly to Barracuda, this also impacted all supported versions, virtual and physical. So one thing that Ivanti does is that they maintain and develop a integrity checker tool, which I think is it's a rarity that appliance vendors make these kind of tools available, which I think is really great. It gives organizations something that they can go to try to hunt for this activity. And so how the integrity checker works is introduced in 2021 is that it checks for new or modified files on the device. So it tries to identify what is unexpected on the device, which is a really good technique. And in order to work, it has a manifest of the legit files on the system. It runs every 2 hours on the system by default, and then you can also run it externally. You just have to reboot the device to do that. This is something that CISO recommends organizations run. Now, I want to highlight a few things just when we're looking at the threat of PRC actors. We saw them, for example, in the case of Barracuda, respond to our remediation guidance. And so, of course, this threat actor, UNC5221, responded to both the advice of Ivanti as well as from CISA by, in one case, for example, attempting to evade the ICT, which is in a fairly clever way. And so in one case, they actually re-signed the manifest. And by re-signing the manifest, they were able to essentially add their own malicious files and hashes to the manifest, re-sign it so the ICT would still run, and so when a victim organization would run it, it would come back and appear as clean. So just showing some of the resourcefulness of PRC actors here. We also saw a lot of living off the land in Ivanti cases, right? So they were using code with a much smaller footprint, and some of this was, and I guess a few other things. One is living off the land. It's far stealthier rather than deploying their own malware families. But something to note is that a lot of what we've seen by UNC5221 requires a lot of targeted knowledge of these devices. I mean, even in the case of Barracuda, I remember talking to some of their developers and how these actors very clearly knew the device, in some cases better than the developers themselves, just due to the sheer amount of resources that they can pour into looking at these products, which some of them are the code bases can be rather old or maintained for a long period of time. And so it takes a lot of resources to really deeply understand your code, and PRC definitely invests into that.
Yeah, and I think here with this incident, I think it was a good opportunity to highlight that. Like, Austin came to me like, "Hey, this is going on." This was a group I didn't happen to be working on, but I knew who was able to quickly connect the right people in the bureau with Austin and their team, and they were able to really get up to speed real quickly instead of having to get intake through some place and then a couple days later finally get to the right bureau person. Austin was able to ring up, and I'm always happy to take Austin's calls, and we're able to get going on this incident quite quickly.
So looking at the end goals here, which was widespread data theft. So similar to the Barracuda case, what we identified is that the actor was dumping the configuration files on these Ivanti devices, as well as the cache, which contained credential material, sometimes in plain text, other times hashed, session cookies and identifiers. These could be used to either take over a VPN session or connect to a user's VPN session. And these were exfiltrated to just the web server, and then they also, they cleared logs and removed remnants. So again, kind of showing some of their emphasis on stealth here. Now, going to our third example, which I think is pretty interesting, is the emergence of the emerging threat of PRC-aligned freelance actors. So one of these actors that Google Threat Intelligence Group has been tracking, we track as UNC5174. They go by the handle Uteus. They are a hacktivist persona who conducts financially motivated operations, but also is claimed to be affiliated with China's Ministry of State Security, or MSS. We believe that they have been working as an initial access broker and possibly as a contractor who conducts for-profit intrusions. UNC5174 has weaponized multiple vulnerabilities soon after they're publicly announced and exploited them as end-day vulnerabilities, including vulnerabilities in Ivanti, Connect Secure, and other devices, and exploited these en masse before they could be patched. We've identified multiple China Nexus actors leveraging the exploits that were used by UNC5174, which I think underscores how UNC5174 may be enabling the operations of other PRC actors. If you have anything to say.
Yeah, I think it's really important in the context of this emerging PRC cyber threats like these freelance individuals, is that it makes the entire ecosystem incredibly busy, and you are no longer really able to this group is used this discrete TTPs, this group used this discrete set of TTPs. It's all becoming quite intermixed, right? And it really makes the importance of good threat intel and good threat intel sharing to really be able to identify and tease out, okay, what's happening here? Are there any things I know about that group that I can use to apply for my, for remediation for defense? And by, collaborating with Austin on this threat group, constantly discussing kind of what we're seeing, I think makes our efforts much more effective.
Absolutely. Something else that we've observed is overlap in actually some of the overlap in some of the actual exploit code used by UNC5221 and UTAEUS, which tells us that in some cases we believe there may be a common exploit developer, or rather that exploit code. We do know that within the PRC exploit ecosystem, that oftentimes exploits and 0 days and end days are widely shared across various PRC actors, which can make attribution difficult. And like Tony mentioned, there's a lot of noise and a lot of different PRC aligned and nexus actors exploiting these vulnerabilities. So moving to the conclusion, so PRC actors, they continue to evolve their operations. They're dramatically more coordinated today than they were, say, 10 years ago. I think we've explained and shown in a few different examples here that they are well equipped to respond to remediation activities and are very capable and understand the appliances that they're targeting. Sharing tools and techniques across multiple groups, such as UTAEUS and others, definitely makes attribution challenging. We also see the exploitation of 0-day vulnerabilities, like I mentioned before, is increasing. Less deployment of malware on Windows system, and this has, I think, been a common theme at CDS this year, is that we're seeing actors target devices with EDR less frequently. It's definitely in decline, and instead they circumvent them as much as they can. One of those ways is by targeting either SaaS providers or edge devices. And then just that focus on stealth, right? I mean, this, I think, is their priority above all for these espionage operations, is we see them coming up with new, unique methods to remain undetected for longer and longer periods of time.
Yeah, and so I think Austin and I have showed some, like, a couple good cases of historic collaboration, but we continue to have an ongoing relationship and collaborate together. We're watching this specific threat group, and I think we've had some good results, whether it's the second Barracuda vulnerability or monitoring for anything related to Juniper. We're conducting a lot of threat intelligence sharing. We're on all these emerging PRC cyber threats because the ecosystem's only getting more and more active and busy, and through that we're sharing IOC's threats that we're seeing. And from the FBI's perspective, I think we're trying to be more and more proactive in sharing as much as we can. Obviously, there's always going to be things we can't share, but we found working with the private sector and people like Austin that if we can get out there, we really are able to solve the work against the problem much more effectively. And having the individual relationships that Austin and I have, like, we work for large organizations with a lot of resources, but being able to pick up the phone and talk to Austin, or you can call me, we're able to really get our organizations engaged. And so encourage you all out there, find your local FBI agent. We have cyber squads everywhere. We're always willing to go out and make connections and get to know you, give you a threat briefing, because we don't want the first time we interact to be when y'all are a victim. That's a terrible place to meet first. And I think going forward, to piggyback kind of what Austin was saying, we continue to see a trend in targeting of network edge products, VPNs, firewalls, these email gateways, and we're seeing stealthy custom malware sitting on those that are hard to detect. And one thing to highlight when it comes to sort of supply chain issues is that we're seeing, as Austin mentioned, these open source code libraries. They in and of themselves may not be vulnerable, but their implementation can cause issues. We've seen multiple times these email gateways were hit with very similar attack paths. So that's something that we will continue to be on the lookout for and just want to raise awareness about. And I think looking at all the victimology here, we've seen the traditional high value targets are being compromised and targeted, but it's not just them. All devices that are sitting on the internet are potential targets. Whether or not they're being targeted in and of themselves, with these orb networks and definitely more ephemeral IPs, they're targeting devices that sit in everyone's homes, and so the attack surface is quite large. And so I think going off of that, I just want to reiterate the FBI here is to be a good partner in cyber here. These PRC cyber actors are continuing to conduct these cyber attacks, whether it's espionage, stealing intellectual property, or other threats to national security. And the private sector plays a huge role in helping us secure that, because in more cases than not, the private sector is on the front line for these things. And so, the FBI is out here. We are committed to building and maintaining these long-term trusted relationships, within appropriate bounds. But we want to be, work together in combating this problem. We want to, ultimately build like a more forward-leaning, proactive posture to help defend our networks.
And we're up on time, but we'll leave you with a quote. This is from former director Christopher Wray. The PRC has a bigger hacking program than every other nation combined. And in order to counter these threats, we need to collaborate not just as an industry, but also, with our public sector partners, both, in the U.S. and abroad, because it really takes a combined effort to counter such a well-resourced threat. And with that, we appreciate your time.
Thank you.